Greetings and welcome. I hope you are healthy. I hope you are well. I hope you're in good spirits. I hope that you're focused and curious, or at least curious enough to dive into the transformative presidency of Ronald Reagan, the 40th president of the United States. We will be talking about the domestic arena in this lecture, and in a forthcoming talk, we will dive into the international dimensions of the Reagan years. And insofar as the domestic arena is concerned, we'll begin by talking about Reagan's epic 1980 election and his remarkably victorious 1984 election, and then we will get into so-called Reaganomics, which is to say the economic policies of the Reagan years, which were challenged and challenging, and we'll get into the culture wars, ending with some other important events that occurred on Reagan's watch, some of which are directly a result of his policies, others of which he just happened to be in office during. So, with that said, the election of 1980, Jimmy Carter, who was not a particularly popular president, even within his own party, Carter survived a primary challenge from the more progressive wing of his party, embodied by Senator Edward Kennedy. Um, it was a nasty fight within the Democratic Party for the future of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was either going to move to the left or stay in the center, and Carter pulled the party back towards the center for better or for worse. The Republican Party moved away from the center, nominating Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California. Reagan has come up in this class before. He was, by all means, an important figure in 1960s and 70s politics and culture. In the 1930s and 40s, Reagan was very much a New Deal Democrat. He was also a B-movie star and was very popular among his fellow actors and actresses, and he became the president of the Screen Actors Guild in the 1940s during the House Un-American Activities Committee crisis. And so Reagan became a political name in his capacity as the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and he became a household name because he became the spokesman for General Electric in the 1950s. And as the spokesman for America's flagship industry, Reagan got very, very wealthy, perhaps because of that. He became a Republican in the early 1960s. I say that sort of tongue-in-cheek. Reagan spoke at some length about his transformation from being a Democrat to being a Republican, and perhaps that will come up later in this talk. He became the governor of California in the late 60s and served 2 terms on a law and order platform, pledging to the fine people of California that he was going to quell the unrest on college campuses, and he was going to unite Californians against what he and his supporters saw as an insurgence of anti-American types, right? Communists, hippies, and yippies. And he had no patience for that, and um, he capitalized on the unrest in California. There was a third-party candidate for my fair state of Illinois. That's John Anderson, and he was a more moderate Republican, sometimes known as a Rockefeller Republican. And we talked about Rockefeller Republicans when we talked about the election of 1968. So this is Reagan from Dodge City to Tombstone. His guns were the only law. Ronald Reagan in Law and Order. And then here's a button from the first debate in October of 1980. Actually, that couldn't have been the first debate, but it was one of the debates between Carter and Reagan. Carter faced an uphill climb, to say the very least. His platform supported alternative energies. Jimmy Carter was and is, to this very day, a supporter of environmental action. He's been trying to get the United States to pivot from its suicidal energy policy towards something more sustainable for America and for the world. And he's been a leading voice in that, though we all know that America still has so far to go when it comes to developing a 21st century energy supply. Carter supported the divisive Equal Rights Amendment, and we've talked about the Equal Rights Amendment, and we've talked about Phyllis Schlafly, and we talked about the defeat, ultimately, of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1983. The third major part of his platform was to get the economy back in order, right? In talking about Nixon and Ford and Carter, we were dealing with stagflation, so-called double-digit inflation rates at 11, 12, 13%. And look, whether or not Carter was responsible for creating inflation, and I don't think he was, it is the job of the President of the United States to do everything in their power to keep prices under control. And so Carter promised to do that. And as a fourth part of his platform, Carter sought to be an anti-Reaganite. He tried to pull the Lyndon Johnson move. You might recall the Daisy ad where LBJ claimed that if the American people voted for Goldwater, that there would be a nuclear apocalypse. And for his part, Carter was making similar claims about Reagan, right? That Reagan was going to start World War III. Yeah. That he was, basically drank his own Kool-Aid when it came to, the power of guns and his ability to restore law and order. And that a vote for Reagan was a vote for war with the Soviet Union. Now, Carter faced some serious liabilities. I think maybe too much is discussed with regard to this, but it is sort of one of the major charges against Jimmy Carter. This idea that Jimmy Carter was sort of this dour figure, that he didn't speak to the hopes and the dreams of the American people. In fact, he gave a speech where he said that the American people had a crisis of confidence, and that they suffered from what he called malaise. Right, that the American people were suffering from the fallout of the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement and all of the divisiveness and the assassinations of great leaders and Watergate and stagflation, and that the American people had lost their spirit. And of course, Reagan comes in and says, who's this fool saying that we've lost our spirit? We're the best country in the world, right? We are the most spirited people on earth. And Reagan embodied that. He embodied the charisma that remained in the American people. And he was funny and he was smart and he's a great actor and he could command an audience. And Jimmy Carter couldn't. Jimmy Carter was like a very humble, quiet, hardworking public servant. And he was up against an actor and sort of a populist and someone who could command an audience like few others. But it wasn't just Reagan's charisma that helped him to defeat Carter in such an astounding way. It was that Carter made real mistakes, right? As we've discussed, perhaps his most substantial mistake, although there's a lot of questions about what could have actually been done about it, is that for the last 444 days of his presidency, you had Americans being held hostage in the embassy in Tehran. And that was humiliating, absolutely humiliating. And so the American people were like, well, look, if this guy can't negotiate with the Iranians, and if he called Iran the island of stability only to have the American embassy captured by the Iranian insurgency, then why should we vote for this fool? Moreover, the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and Carter did little to stop it. Again, I'm not quite sure what Carter could have done to stop it, but it is nevertheless the case that this uh, uh, was tantamount to a liability. And so Carter walked into the election of 1980 injured, severely injured, and it was going to be hard for him to beat Ronald Reagan. Reagan's platform was building on Nixon's platform, the desire to shift from federal to state power. Remember New Federalism under the Nixon regime. This is sort of a play on that. Reagan promised to reduce government spending and to cut taxes in his effort to end what he called the, quote, failed social engineering of the New Deal consensus. Reagan came to power to destroy the New Deal, the Fair Deal, the New Frontier, the Great Society, the American liberal tradition that had dominated American politics for 47 years, right? Since 1933, when FDR took office. Reagan promised to support traditional American values. Now, of course, he chose from some traditions and not others, but particularly, family, religion, and patriotism. And for this, Reagan earned vigorous support from the so-called New Right. And when I say New Right, I mean Christian conservatives. And we'll talk about their impact on American politics in this lecture. Ultimately, what Reagan did is he channeled the anger of mainstream white Americans who were, basically fed up with discussions about minority rights. They were sick of hearing about immigrants and affirmative action. They found feminists to be divisive. They were sick of, paying socialist style taxes, 70% in the highest margin. And they were sick of big government. Now, there's a question to be asked about the degree to which the American people were actually sick of the New Deal consensus versus the degree to which Reagan made them sick of it. But it's surely the case that the Vietnam War and Watergate really gutted the American people's faith in government. And one has to ask the question and really grapple with the question of if we don't really trust the government, then why should we trust the government with our taxes? Why should we trust the government to, run our schools? Why should we trust the government to run our healthcare systems? Like, if we don't trust the government, then shouldn't we limit their power? And that was the Reagan argument, right? He said that the most dangerous words, the scariest words in the American lexicon were, "Hi, I'm from the government, and I'm here to help." Yeah. And he said that to huge applause. Yeah. And lastly, the Reagan platform, which also earned a fair amount of applause, was the increase of military spending. Reagan wanted to end the détente that Nixon had helped to architect. Reagan wanted to, and this depends on how you look at it, either renew the Cold War or end it, which is to say win it, which ultimately he did. And we'll talk about that in the second part of this talk. The results were astounding. Reagan defeated Carter by a 10-1 margin in the Electoral College. Reagan won 44 states, but 51% of the vote to Carter's 41. John Anderson of Illinois had the sixth best party result after Roosevelt fighting Bob Lafayette, George Wallace, and Ross Perot in the 90s. So we have a substantial third party result. You also, and this is part of the reason they call it the Reagan Revolution, the Republicans gained 34 seats in the House and 12 seats in the Senate. And though the Democrats hung on to the House by a substantial margin, this was a huge swing for the Republicans. And Carter became the first president of the United States to be unseated by the American electorate since Herbert Hoover. And Reagan, at 69 years old, was the oldest president to be elected to the office of the President of the United States until Donald Trump, who was almost a year older when he took office. This is the electoral map of 1980. Pretty ugly for the Democrats. Carter won Georgia in the South, but only because he's from Georgia, as we know. Otherwise, just a total landslide. In the election of 1980, we had a substantial realignment of the parties. The New Deal Democrat coalition of the urban North, the Democratic South, the African Americans, the Union members, and so-called newer ethnic groups, Latinos and Asians, and farmers got realigned, and the farmers tended to move towards Reagan. Whether they were in the Midwest or the South, the Republicans appealed very successfully to farming communities and rural communities more broadly across the United States. What Reagan did rather expertly, and Richard Nixon was good at dog whistling this stuff, Reagan didn't use the dog whistle. He was very, blunt in his appeals to evangelical America. Republicans overwhelmingly won the evangelical vote. They made lots of promises to evangelicals that we'll get into. Reagan reached out to the wealthiest Americans by, promising them tax cuts, which he did deliver on. So-called yuppies, which is to say, young urban professionals. Reagan appealed to blue-collar workers in the North and the Midwest, making promises to unions but not delivering on them. And he appealed to foreign policy hawks. And this Reagan coalition is what the Republican Party in 2020, 2021 is still trying to hold on to. Democrats are trying to make headway into places like Georgia and Texas and North Carolina, and Republicans are doing everything they can to in Arizona, and Republicans are doing everything they can to hold on to the Reagan coalition. It's safe to say that American politics are ready for another realignment. Both parties are divided right now, and we'll see what the future holds for the coalitions, both of the Democrats and of the Republicans. In 1984, Reagan won just a shocking landslide. He won with 59% of the popular vote, which is just huge by American standards. He also won 525 electoral votes. Walter Mondale, who just died last week, who was a great public servant, a great man by all accounts, but not a victor at all in the 1984 election. Mondale ran with Geraldine Ferraro, the first female candidate for high office, executive office in the United States. The Democrats kept the House in 1984, although they lost another 16 seats. And the Republicans kept the Senate, although the Democrats gained 2 back. But if you want to know how popular Ronald Reagan was, here you go. Take a look at it. He was popular. Now, part of Reagan's appeal was his promise to the American people of a bubbling economy. Reagan embodies the backlash against the New Deal consensus. Because the economy was suffering from stagflation throughout the 1970s, Reagan and this new Republican Party blamed not the change of the international order and the rise of countries like Germany and Japan. Yeah. Not the Vietnam War, which challenged Great Society spending, but instead, the Reagan team blamed the entire New Deal promise, the entire New Frontier and Great Society promise. They thought it was bankrupt. And what Reagan represents is a really robust repudiation of that 37-year tradition. Can I call it tradition? Of center-left politics in the United States. Yeah. So just to remind you, right? So in the first decades of the 20th century, you have this progressive impulse and these progressive politicians and Woodrow Wilson who are seeking to use the power of the federal government and the power of the presidency in particular to, reach into the lives of American people to try to make their lives better, right? This belief that, you know, government offers a public service and that presidents are public servants in chief and that they have not just the right but the responsibility to actively engage in making the lives of American people better, using the power of the government to architect a better life for American people. And of course, during World War I, the government takes on unprecedented powers in developing the economy and infiltrating sort of the social lives of Americans. And that gets repudiated by Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover in the 1920s, who really, they themselves, doing away with the notion that the government has any responsibilities at all in the economy, let alone the social lives of the American people. And we see what happens with these three Republican presidents. Of course, the 1920s end in catastrophe, and the 1930s are defined by the Great Depression. And the New Deal consensus emerges from that. And FDR taking on, building on, the successes of the progressives and armed with the spirit of the progressives. FDR and Truman, build a robust safety net for the American people. And, Eisenhower does little to nothing to repudiate that, right? And Kennedy and Johnson expand this safety net to farmers and to communities of color and to the poorest of Americans. And then the American economy really begins to suffer. Now, I'm not going to try to, navigate the extent to which the New Frontier and the Great Society are responsible for the downturn in the American economy. That's a very difficult question, and I don't want it to be an ideological question. It's really an economic question. But ideologically speaking, people on the right believe that the stagflation of the 1970s was a direct result of the failures of the New Deal consensus and the Great Society in particular. And so the effort was to roll that back, right? And Reagan challenged it, and he pushed the pendulum very far to the right, and it's never come back, for better or worse. It has never come back. There has not been ambitious Democrats like Kennedy or FDR or Johnson. As we'll see, Bill Clinton was hardly a New Deal Democrat, and Barack Obama was hardly a New Deal Democrat. So the Reagan Revolution, thus, is this repudiation of the New Deal consensus, pushing the American economy so far to the right that it hasn't come back. That's the so-called revolution. And, we can debate later in class whether Reagan's economic policies were really tantamount to revolution. That's like one of those interesting questions when we reflect on the Reagan years, right? To what degree was this really a revolution? Yeah. Right. So that's a little context to understand Reaganomics. Let's talk about what Reaganomics, aka supply side economics, aka trickle down economics, really is. All right. Reaganomics seeks to first cut government spending, right? To protect middle class programs like Social Security and Medicare, but to slash programs geared towards the lower class. Things like Medicaid, aid to families with dependent children, food stamps, mass transit, job training. These programs were believed by Reaganites and are believed by Reaganites to this very day to be coddling programs, that if you give people food stamps, then they have no incentive to work. Yeah. If you give people Medicaid, then they have no incentive to find a job that pays them more so that they can get off Medicaid and into a better privately funded medical program. Yeah. That programs geared towards the lower class disincentivize work. Okay. And so we should cut government spending, particularly on programs that might disincentivize work. Yeah. Cut income taxes, but also cut capital gains taxes, right? Lower taxes, less spending, let the free market work itself out. The supply side theory sounds something like this. If you cut the capital gains tax, if you cut the income tax, if you cut corporate taxes, then corporations and companies can hire more people. More people will have money in their pockets. Those people will spend that money. They'll go to more restaurants. They'll take more vacations. They'll buy that second car. They'll trade in their car for, a newer model. And armed with capital, people will spend, and that's what will sustain the economy. That when the government is taxing at rates of, 90% during the Eisenhower years, highest marginal rate, 70% during the Nixon years. Yeah. When the government is taxing at that rate, then the government becomes the arbiter of the economy. It makes the economy less free. And so people should have their taxes cut so that they can be free to decide what they want to spend their money on. So it's an economic freedom argument. And the notion is that if you cut the taxes of the people and the companies at the top, that the money will trickle down to regular people like you and I. Yeah. If you cut corporate tax rates, then corporations can pay their employees more. If you cut employee tax rates, then they can go support local businesses and spread the money around. And listen, it's obviously the case that to some degree, people need to have financial freedom. What should the highest marginal tax rate be in a country like the United States in 1980 or in 2021? I don't know. And you don't know. Surely during times of war and times of crisis, taxes probably should go up. I can't imagine, winning World War II without taxes or without substantial income taxes and corporate taxes. How do you defeat an environmental crisis? How do you defeat a public health crisis? Are taxes the answer or are taxes the problem? My only hope for you, and I'm sure I've said this before in class, but being a high school teacher, who am I if I don't just repeat myself ad nauseum? My hope for you is to not be ideological about your thinking about taxes. There are times in a country's history where high taxes are necessary and proper, and there are times in a country's history where taxes need to be reduced. Ultimately, though, I have come to conclude that sometimes it's not just the rates that matter, it's the enforcement of those rates. So if you shift the highest marginal rate from 70% to 40%, but you cut out all the loopholes so that 40% is really 40%. And if middle-class people are paying 22%, but they're actually paying it, that works. So it's not just the income tax or capital gains tax, right? It's the enforcement of those taxes. Okay. So again, the four goals, the first is to cut spending. The second, as it relates to that, is to cut taxes. The third is to tighten the money supply to reduce inflation. And then the last goal of Reaganomics is to deregulate the economy, to reduce government regulations, to so-called free the market. Let's talk about deregulation. Now listen, same comment about regulation that I just made about taxes. The question is not, should we or should we not regulate the economy, regulate business? Of course, we should have regulations. The question is more which industries and which sectors should be regulated and to what degree, right? During the 1970s, you had some loosening of laws which opened up the doors for political action committees and lobbyists to impact legislation. Prior to the 1970s, Washington was not teeming with lobbyists from different industries and special interest groups. But because of congressional legislation that was passed, by Democrats, by the way, in the 1970s, you had this boom of political action committees and lobbyists. And I want to talk about the impact of deregulation gone awry. In particular, the case of savings and loans, S&Ls. Now, savings and loans, also known as thrifts, are banking institutions that invest in mortgages. Sometimes they invest in good, solid mortgages among middle class, middle upper class people, but oftentimes these thrifts invest in risky mortgages. And in the 1980, and then again in 1982, there was legislation that was passed that gave thrifts just like a whole menu of instruments that they could use with little to no regulation by the federal government, which is to say the FDIC wasn't really monitoring what these banking institutions were doing, right? And for that reason, these savings and loan industries grew substantially by 40, 50, 60% in the early 1980s. Yeah. And then these different S&Ls were sort of brought together. They congealed as a result of mergers and acquisitions and buyouts. And through all of these different acquisitions, there were these companies that had these insane debts. And then they had to file bankruptcy to get out of the debts. By 1989, 1 in 3 of these savings and loans failed. And the American taxpayer was forced to bail out $500 million worth of thrift failures, right? And so what we have here, and of course, the devil's in the details, and I don't expect you to know like exactly what thrifts do, but what we have here in the deregulation of thrifts is a partial gutting of the FDIC, right? The New Deal program, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, a deregulation of this sector of the banking economy. And when it was deregulated, when the cats were away, the mice were a playing. And those mice ended up accruing $500 million worth of debt that taxpayers like me had to bail out. And so, again, deregulation isn't always bad. There are questions that I have no answers to about how and the degree to which banks and other financial institutions should be regulated, right? But this is an obvious case of failure. Yeah. The spirit of deregulation isn't necessarily bad, but in this case, deregulation failed. I'll give you another example of a failure. Yeah. James Watt, who faced a rather substantial confirmation hearing, a rather divisive confirmation hearing in the Senate became the Secretary of the Interior. He cut the Environmental Protection Agency by almost 20%. You know, he stopped regulating the environment, allowing for more toxic dumping and pollution. In the 1980s, we had we were exacerbating the size of the hole in the ozone layer. Oil extraction was leading to nasty pollution of the air and the water. And as EPA head, he opened the door to that. He basically winked and nodded at American industrialists and said, you feel free to run full steam ahead. We're not going to be watching. Yeah. He sold tons of public land rather, to private investors, opening up more land for drilling. You see this Time magazine with James Watt's face on the cover. Going, the land sale of the century. He sold off sacred American land, beautiful American land, to multinational corporations who destroyed it, for oil. And playing to the Christian conservatives that were part of the Reagan umbrella, he said, quote, "I don't know how many future generations we can count on before the Lord returns. Whatever it is, we have to manage with the skill to leave the resources needed for future generations." Basically saying, like, God's going to take care of this. Our time on this earth is limited, so we should just use what we can, while we can. James Watt, and you can decide the degree to which you want to hold Reagan responsible for this. But he was a liar and a thief. He was found guilty of 25 counts of perjury, obstruction, and influence peddling when he moved over to Housing and Urban Development. Time magazine named him one of the top 10 worst cabinet appointments in U.S. history. Half of those are Nixon appointees, by the way. And he ultimately, not so fun fact, he ultimately was forced to step down because he was known for telling racist and sexist jokes. So, James Watt, in addition to being like a deregulator in chief, was just sort of like a turd. And look, the American people are still trying to, recover from some of the environmental devastation that happened under Reagan's watch because of his appointment of James Watt. So we looked at the savings and loans. We looked at the environmental deregulation, and now we should take a look at the unions. So Reagan was, despite being the president of the Screen Actors Guild, a union, defiantly anti-union. And he believed that unions, well, they were too regulated. Unions, in Reagan's mind, undermined, fair trade and free competition. And he took a shot across the bow in 1981 when 13,000 air traffic controllers went on strike. Now, the Air Traffic Controllers Union is a federal union, and federal unions, government unions, unlike auto workers unions, they can't go on strike. But the air traffic controllers, these are the people, who bring in airplanes, right? They control air traffic. They were working 40-hour weeks. And listen, 40-hour week is the standard, right? They won and they got a 42-hour week. But these are people who have to be out in the freezing cold, right? Like you're on the tarmac in Minnesota, right? You're doing work which, if you make any mistakes, can have a really tragic impact on human lives. And so they wanted a 32-hour work week. Now, do they deserve it? Listen, I don't know. I'm not here to mitigate that. They wanted more pay in a 32-hour week, and Of the 13,000 that went on strike, Reagan hired the 11,000 that stayed on strike. 2,000 went back to work. And Reagan put the military in charge of air traffic control. And then he took the probably illegal step of banning all of the air traffic controllers that went on strike from federal employment for the rest of their lives. Bill Clinton reversed this when he got to office. He was of the opinion that was just illegal, to say nothing of the morality of it. The Air Traffic Controllers Union was bankrupted and decertified. There is no more Air Traffic Controllers Union. And the reason that I talk about the air traffic controller strike, a couple of reasons. First, it reminds me of the Great Railroad Strike, which we talked about, which really threatened to disrupt commerce. And we asked this question, which we really have to be serious about, like when does a sector of the economy have the right to strike? Can teachers go on strike, right? Like, can train workers go on strike? I mean, they can, but like, what's the calculus on that? If teachers go on strike, it totally, undermines the stability of families. It undermines the economy. You got to send your kids to school, or you can't go to work as often as not. So air traffic controllers really shut it down. And so I bring it up first because it's this question that we've asked throughout this class. Second, I bring it up because it showed how strong Reagan's anti-union views were. And I say that to say this: the Air Traffic Controllers Union supported Reagan in his election campaign, right? And he stood up against them. He's like, I don't care if you support me or not. I'm not going to take strikes. And this was a watershed moment in his presidency because it showed how anti-union he was willing to be. And he wanted to destroy unions. Yeah, he saw them as detrimental to American freedom. Yeah, and of course, people on the old left very much disagreed with Reagan. Reagan cut taxes twice, in 81 and 86. In the 81 tax cut, he lowered the marginal tax rate from 70 to 50%, and then the lowest bracket from 14 to 11%. He cut estate taxes and corporate taxes, $150 billion between 1981 and 86. So the government's getting fewer inputs, and he reduced capital gains to 20%. So capital gains, which is like an example of a capital gain tax, is if you buy a stock and then you sell it within 20 days, you pay a higher rate on that than if you sold it after a year. And the capital gains tax was down to 20%, the lowest since the Hoover administration. In 1986, Reagan cut taxes again. And this time, he lowered the highest marginal rate to 28%. He also simplified the tax system by eliminating deductions and reducing the number of tax brackets. So we see the marginal rate going from 70 to 28%. Yeah. In the 8 years of the Reagan administration. This is a substantial cut in taxes. And so we're going to have to look at now the impact of that on the economy, right? So just to sort of summarize, right? The Department of Defense budget rose from 267 to 393 billion, right? It went from 4.9 to 5%, 5.8% of GDP, from 23 to 27% of public expenditures. So we have tax cuts and the defense budget rising. And then the US goes from being the greatest creditor nation in the world to the greatest debtor nation in the world. Yeah. The national debt rose from about 100 billion to about 3 trillion. So you want to know what happened when Reagan cut taxes? The US went from being the largest creditor, the largest debtor nation. And the number one cost in America is the interest on the debt. The greatest expenditure in America, in American political life and government life, is the interest that we pay on our, I forget what it is now, like our $26 trillion debt. Fact check me. I don't feel like looking it up right now. Unemployment, though bumpy, went well. Unemployment went from 7% in 1980 to 11%, then down to 5% in 88. So, 5% is basically zero unemployment. So unemployment, Reagan's record of unemployment is pretty good, but, there were fewer union jobs, there were fewer well-paying jobs, there were fewer stable jobs. So, not all employment is equal. Unemployment numbers, they say something, right, about the quantity of people employed, or at least the quantity of people looking for work, right? That's what the unemployment rate is. It's the percentage of people, looking for work. Some people give up looking for work and they're not counted as unemployed. And it's okay to give up looking for work. If you're a billionaire, maybe you shouldn't be employed. That's a perfectly good reason to be unemployed. If you're a stay-at-home parent and you don't want to work because you don't have to, then you're not counted as unemployed. If you're a stay-at-home parent that would love to work but can't find a job that pays you enough to leave the home, then and afford childcare, then that's another story. But, generally speaking, we look at unemployment, low unemployment rates as a good thing. So give Reagan credit where it's due there, I suppose. The inflation rate went down from 10 to 4%. And the Reagan administration whipped inflation. And so credit where it's due. And the stock market was doing great in the 80s until all of the deregulation that led to a 23% decline in the stock market in 87. So the record on the stock market crash on the stock market is not so good. So let's dive into some numbers, some visual representation of numbers. This is the U.S. unemployment rate, as you see, from 7% when he took office to 11%, and then down to basically nothing. Yeah. So that's the unemployment rate. Credit where it's due. Again, job growth. This is Clinton, Reagan, Obama, and both Bushes as measured by the cumulative percentage change during their term. And so of the last 5 presidents, or of 5 of the last presidents, Reagan was second. There was job growth. It wasn't union jobs. They weren't high-paying jobs, but there was job growth. Yeah. Spending. Reagan, despite cutting taxes, Reagan spent the most of any recent president as measured by the annual average percent of GDP. Yeah. So again, look, if you want to cut taxes, cut taxes. Like I wouldn't mind paying less taxes, but then you got to cut spending, or you end up in debt, and that's what happened. Mostly because of defense spending, as we'll talk about in the second half of this lecture when we talk about the international dimensions of the Reagan regime. Reagan wanted to win the Cold War. He wanted to starve out the USSR. And so we have this military buildup, and look, it ended the Cold War, and we can debate, and we will debate the degree to which Reagan is responsible for defeating the Soviet Union and ending the Cold War. Reaganites give him, singular credit, and others believe that while Reagan played a role, it was hardly a central role in, pushing the teetering USSR to its final fall. But that's not the purview of this lecture. The point is he cut taxes and increased spending, and the biggest spending increase was on military. This led to a huge budget deficit. Yeah. And it went up throughout the Reagan and George H.W. Bush years. I didn't even mention that George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, was Reagan's vice president, who later became president. And then his son later became president, George W. Bush. We'll get into him. Anyway, we see huge deficits under the Republicans. Interest on debt, huge, huge, huge. The U.S. spends a ghastly sum of money just on the interest on its debt. This is union membership from 1967 to 2012. It's been a steady and precipitous decline. Reagan and Reagan-esque policies were responsible for the death of the American Union, which you can either celebrate or mourn. I don't care. Yeah. But you see on this graph, the reduction of union membership along with the reduction of the middle class. Yeah. Right. There's nothing to protect middle class wages and benefits anymore. Oil prices went down precipitously during the 1980s, and so you would think that if you're able to run an economy on cheap oil, that it's really hard to go into debt when the price of oil goes from $120 a barrel to $60 a barrel down to $20 a barrel, and still the American economy was struggling. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average, we see, takes a huge dump from a peak of 2,700 down to 1,700 because of this deregulation and because of the risky types of investments that the Reagan administration allowed for. Okay? Now, that was... So I should seek to say something conclusive here about the Reagan economy. Reagan gets a lot of credit from Republicans to this very day for his stewardship of the economy. He destroyed unions. He undermined the Great Society. And for that reason, he's very much a hero in the eyes of a lot of Republicans. His economic record is, of course, at best a little bit more mixed than that. I mean, the data speaks very clearly to it. I guess, to give some voice to, Reaganites, there is a viable question as to the capacity for the Great Society to thrive in the United States. We can ask through pragmatic and non-ideological lenses about the sustainability of the New Deal and the Great Society. Ultimately, the American people, enough American people, as evidenced by Reagan's astonishing victories, the American people were sick of the government in their lives. And so, to the extent to which it is the prerogative of the president to cater to the instincts of the people, and if the instincts of the people were to slash, Great Society programs, then it's his responsibility to do so. The other side of that is, or an other side of that is, part of the reason that they wanted the Great Society program slashed is because Reagan told them that they wanted those programs slashed, right? And these very debates that Reagan raises over the role of the government in the economy are still very much alive today. And we'll talk in forthcoming weeks about, the both Bush administrations and the Clinton administration and how they dealt with the economic legacy of the Reagan years. Now, to get into some cultural issues, the cultural landscape of America in the 1980s was very much dominated by a resurgence in religion. And this resurgence in religion we might call the new right. Remember, we talked about the new left. Well, here's the new right. The new right is defined by the so-called moral majority. You know, the majority of Americans who, they don't like hippies, they don't like drugs, they're not too much into thinking about race. They are defiantly anti-feminist. Yeah, and it's a coalition of Christians. In the 80s, led by such people as Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Bob Jones, Oral Roberts, Jim Baker, led by think tanks like the Family Research Council, the Witherspoon Institute, think tanks that reach into colleges like Liberty University, Bob Jones University, Oral Roberts U. And the moral majority, the new right, there are 4: school prayer, harsh prison sentencing, gay conversion, and this notion that we loosely call the American family. And of course, that family is, monoracial. It is mom and dad. Yeah, it's a straight family, and there's a couple of kids. Yeah, and these kids are obedient to the mom, and the mom's obedient to the dad. Right. So therefore, family. And they are against pornography, homosexuality, the Equal Rights Amendment, divorce in most cases, abortion in almost all cases, affirmative action, secularism, and of course, socialism. Yeah. The new right, are culture warriors. And they use their powerful political action committees to launch their culture wars. Yeah. And their new right was able to reach more people through televangelism. Perhaps you've seen on TV in America, every day of the week, but particularly on Sundays, you have these sort of, charismatic preachers, these mega congregations. Sometimes they bring people up from the congregation and they heal them. People who can't walk, they come up on stage, and all of a sudden, miraculously, through the power of the Lord, they can walk again. Yeah. This is what I grew up. I'm a child of the 80s. Growing up in a Jewish home, of course, I didn't have a whole lot to do on Sunday morning. So we watched professional wrestling and we watched televangelism. It was on all 3 stations, the televangelists, from, 10 to 12 o'clock. We have a first great awakening in this class in the colonies. We have a second great awakening in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And while this isn't, ordinarily called the third great awakening, I think it's worth questioning whether what we saw in the 1980s was tantamount to a third great awakening. We'll see if historians call it such. Indeed, my childhood is now the thing of history, which is something I have to just sort of swallow. I think maybe I'll have some coffee. Maybe I'll swallow that instead. Go juice. All right. So you have the rise of the moral majority. That's a Time magazine cover. I'm using Time magazine for this lecture. The thunder on the right, the growth of fundamentalism. There is the Reverend Jerry Falwell. And here's a pamphlet called American Socialism, Moving America Downhill. You see America's getting warped. And this is a pamphlet published by a Christian Crusade publication in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Yeah. So I want to take as a case study in the new right, Jerry Falwell. He lived a long, healthy life. He was a pastor, a televangelist, and an activist. He is the founder of Liberty University in Virginia, and the Academy, and then Liberty U. Liberty Christian Academy and Liberty University were both segregated, racially segregated. They didn't allow blacks. This is what politicized Jerry Falwell, because the IRS, because of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the IRS does not offer tax-exempt status for segregated institutions. So if you want to have a segregated institution, if you want to have a blacks-only country club or a blacks-only or whites-only school. You can have that. You have that freedom, but you can't be tax exempt. Usually educational institutions are tax exempt. You can't get tax breaks if you're segregating blacks and whites. Okay. So Jerry Falwell was a racist. I don't see any way around that. You hate to make that claim on someone, but it seems pretty clear that if you are against black people coming to your school and university, that you're a racist. Maybe you disagree with me. It makes sense to me. And here's Jerry Falwell with Ronald Reagan, and there's Jerry Falwell Jr. With Donald Trump. Falwell Jr., incidentally, just got sort of squeezed out of the management, the directorship role of Liberty University because there were some photos leaked of him with his hands inappropriately placed on a woman on one of his boats, one of his yachts. He was Jerry Falwell Jr. has been a problematic character for Liberty University for some time. He is a bit of a he's very outspoken in his filter, won't win him any awards. And there he is with Donald Trump, also outspoken and whose filter earns him the ire of some people in some circles. So Falwell got politicized first by the government's demand or preference for desegregated institutions, and then by the 1973 Roe versus Wade decision. Now, I will tell you that the Roe versus Wade decision, which gives women the right to choose whether or not to carry a child to term, was not a religious issue until the late 70s, 78, 79. It wasn't the Roe Wade decision did not create a religious fault line, but Falwell, among others, made this a religious versus secular issue. Okay. On the Brown versus Board of Education ruling of 1954, which desegregated schools, Falwell said, quote, "If Chief Justice Warren and his associates had known God's word and had desired to do the Lord's will, I'm quite confident that the 1954 decision would never have been made. The facilities should be separate. When God has drawn a line of distinction, we should not attempt to cross that line." Right? So God made some people black and some people white, and so those people shouldn't be near each other because God drew that line. That's Jerry Falwell. That's Jerry Falwell being praised by Ronald Reagan. That's Falwell Jr. Thumbs up in with Falwell Jr. With Trump, rather. On feminists, Falwell said, quote, "I listen to feminists and all these radical gals. These women just need a man in the house. That's all they need. Most of the feminists need a man to tell them what time of day it is and to lead them home. And then they blew it and they're all mad at men. Feminists hate men. They're sexist. They just hate men. That's their problem." That's Falwell in 74. Not 54 or 64. 74. Yeek. In an effort to stop Florida from passing a law that would bar discrimination against gay Americans, Falwell said gay folks would just as soon kill you as look at you. He went on to say, quote, "AIDS is not just God's punishment for homosexuals, it's God's punishment for the society that tolerates homosexuals." Yes, my friend, God inflicted the world with AIDS to punish us for our toleration of homosexuals. God also punished us on 9/11. Yeah. Because the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who have tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped 9/11 happen. You helped this happen. So that's Jerry Falwell. He was a total celebrity in the 1980s, and he was a voice of the moral majority. Not to wear my bias on my sleeve here, but I will say I have different morals. And can I just say that this really kind of defined my childhood in a way, right? This sort of culture war between secular and religious Americans, the rising tide of evangelicalism was, I'm a bicentennial baby born in 76. I was 13 when the Berlin Wall fell. My childhood is very much wrapped up in the Reagan years and the rise of not Christianity. America has long been a Christian nation, but the fundamentalist version of Christianity and a Christianity that became politicized. That's also part of the Reagan Revolution. Humble prayer has long been part of American history. And I would go so far as to say that humble prayer and the freedom to pray humbly in the eyes of the Lord is one of the great facets of America. Religious freedom, the freedom to religion. But the other side of that, of course, is the freedom from religion. And the politicization rather, of religion in America in the 1980s is part of that Reagan Revolution. The Reagan Revolution is not just deregulation of the economy and cutting taxes and stomping on unions. It's welcoming into the political fray religious figures, many of whom are very divisive, some of whom are criminal. Jim Bakker, one of the great televangelists of his day, ended up going to jail. Oral Roberts had a, challenged history as well. So religion became once again a divisive fault line in American history. I want to just talk about a series of important domestic events during the Reagan years, starting with Reagan's first year in office, where John Hinckley Jr. shot Reagan. He also shot his press secretary, Jim Brady, a Secret Service agent, and a Capitol Police officer were shot. John Hinckley was what they used to call deranged. He was a paranoid schizophrenic. He felt he needed to shoot Reagan to impress the actress Jodie Foster. Hinckley was unwell, and he served 20 years in jail. By the way, in not just in jail, but in a rehabilitative institution. James Brady, who was shot, suffered. He could never walk again. He was in a wheelchair the rest of his life. He died in the early 20th century due to complications from that assassination attempt. The Brady Bill, as some of you might have heard, is a anti-gun law. There were some gun laws that were passed in the 1980s to limit American access to guns, trying to create for a waiting period between when you apply for a gun license and the time you can procure a gun, to keep people who might be unfit or up to no good from getting guns. That's the Brady Bill. Anyway, Reagan was shot. Interestingly and importantly, he was near death. When he showed up at, I believe it was the Georgetown Hospital, he showed up real close to death. And within a couple of days, he was up and in good spirits and laughing. And this really erased any concerns that Americans had about Ronald Reagan's age. Because when you're shot in the chest and near death in 1969, and a couple of days later, you're up and joking, that did a lot to bolster the spirits of the American people, and to show that their president was not suffering from problems associated with age. Incidentally, I should say that there is this notion on the American left that Reagan had Alzheimer's when he was in office, and when Trump was when similar people on the left were charging that Trump did not have all of his faculties during his presidency, they pointed to Reagan, who did end up suffering from Alzheimer's in the 1990s. I think he was diagnosed in 1994 with Alzheimer's. There is no record of Ronald Reagan having Alzheimer's or having any um, diminishment to his capacities in any medical sense in during his time in office. He was regularly tested, and for years, every year he would get his checkup, and he passed tests with flying colors. So anyway, just putting that out there. Reagan's age, to the extent to which it was a problem, was no longer a problem after he was shot and recovered. In 1981, also, the AIDS crisis began. That begat the further culture war. People, LGBTQ plus communities were, sort of charged with spreading this, and anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment was just common. It was just sickening. Also in 81, unrelated, the first personal computer device was released, the first IBM. And of course, those personal computers never really caught on. It was just sort of a flash in the pan. Flashing forward 5 years, although it's not to say nothing happened in those 5 years. When I was 10 years old, we all got together. They wheeled the TVs in the classroom to watch the space shuttle Challenger launch into orbit. Like, regular people were sent into space, one of whom was a teacher called Krista McAuliffe. And as we all watched it happen, it exploded in midair. And we all just sort of like looked at each other and picked our jaws up off the ground. We also picked our jaws up off the ground. We learned about the Chernobyl meltdown 35 years ago. This year, the Russian nuclear site melted down, further challenging, and the energy sector. There was a hope for nuclear energy, and the 5 Mile Island incident and the Chernobyl accident tampered those hopes. In 1986, also, the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed. This gave Reagan in this act gave amnesty to undocumented people living in the United States, but not necessarily their children. Bill Clinton later gave amnesty to the children of undocumented workers. But in exchange for giving amnesty to undocumented workers, this bill made it illegal for companies to hire undocumented workers, and companies and corporations can pay steep fines for hiring people who came to the United States illegally or extra legally. All right. One more slide, and then we are going to drive this train into the station. Also, during the Reagan years, we have what I'm calling white backlash. It was a backlash to affirmative action. In 1978, the Supreme Court upheld, in some cases, giving preferential treatment to communities that had traditionally been discriminated against in hiring and university admissions. White people were sick of that, and they were sick of what Reagan and others on the right called the welfare queen phenomenon. This was this notion that there were these mostly Black women who were just, driving Cadillacs and, living the high life because they were swindling the food stamp system, the AFDC system, rent control systems. And that this was the problem with the Great Society. You give people an inch, they take a mile. If you don't incentivize working, they're just going to suck the system. And there's a fantastic piece, a Fresca piece in Slate about the origin and etymology of the welfare queen term. So there was a lot of white backlash against the civil rights movement. That in many ways defines the 80s, and this white backlash led to a black backlash that really got codified in rap. You know, NWA and Ice-T, um, Public Enemy, Wu-Tang, fighting back against the white backlash. Reagan and Bush together appointed 4 Supreme Court justices. The war on drugs continued during the 1980s and early 90s, particularly with regard to the crack cocaine epidemic. Of course, the war on drugs was won. Americans no longer have drug problems, so you don't have to worry about that. And last but not least, importantly, during the Reagan years, you had the population shift from the Frost Belt of, Illinois and Wisconsin and Minnesota, Indiana, down to the Southwest, from the Frost Belt to the Sun Belt. This was a manifestation of deindustrialization, right? The industrial jobs were gone, so you might as well go to where it's warm. It was a manifestation of lower taxes in some of those southwestern states. You had people who were retiring down there, and people who went down to Arizona to live the Goldwater dream. They further fostered this conservative movement. So that's a lot. Reagan, I want to try to say something conclusive here. Maybe I'll try this. So Reagan, the 40th president on the Siena poll, ranks 13th out of the 45 presidents. He's almost always in the top quartile. Yeah. The Reagan presidency is respected by historians, though he's a divisive president. He is in that top quartile. His domestic legacy is mixed, let's say. He'd been dubbed the Great Uniter, but it's surely the case that while he might have, helped to heal some of the wounds of the divisive 1960s and 70s, his spirit of unity was mostly limited to white America, white Christian America, perhaps I should say, which was and still thinly is indeed the majority. Now, for those of us equally focused on how the other half lives, as Jacob Riis would say, Reagan isn't exactly a hero. His economic legacy speaks for itself. You saw the data. I guess, if you really want to say something conclusive about the Reagan administration, you would conclude with a question saying, how much debt is healthy? Right? Because ultimately, the Reagan cuts resulted in a huge national debt. And maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. Depends on your feelings about deficits, right? But in many circles, Reagan is remembered for his foreign policy legacy, in particular his anti-communist measures, which, according to the Reaganites, defeated the Soviet Union and thus ended the Cold War. So before we arrive at our tentative conclusions about the Reagan administration, perhaps we should dive into the international arena. And we will do that in a forthcoming talk. Until then, please take care, stay healthy, and I'll talk with you soon. Bye.